Hi guys, this is week 1, day 4, the Gilded Age and the rot being exposed. So we talked about how the Gilded Age is the gold um, exterior and then the rotted interior, and how there's this extreme wealth and industrialization, the growing of cities, the growing of industries and factories, and then you have the rot exposed underneath, which we will talk about today. So The Jungle by Upton Sinclair is one of the things that you will read for today. I want you to look at this image and take a guess of what the jungle may be about, what Upton Sinclair, a muckraker, is trying to say through this book, and take a second looking at the picture and coming up with an answer. Right. So I want you to think about what the American dream is to you. So we talk a lot about the American dream in life. People talk about why people come to the United States. It's for the American dream. Think about what that means for you. How would you define that? If you have to pause the video, that's fine. Think about what the American dream is and what it means to people. How would you define the American dream? So what I define the American dream as is the belief that anyone, regardless of where they're born, what class they were born into, can attain success in America. So that means it doesn't matter if you start at the very bottom, you have the potential, the possibility to become extremely wealthy, become a Rockefeller, become a Jeff Bezos, become extremely wealthy in the United States, no matter where you start. During this time period, you have a huge amount of immigrants coming to the United States to work in factories to take advantage of the American dream. But you also have this 50% of the country struggling with poverty. So out of 11 million of the nation's 12 million families, you have them earning $1,200 per year. So an average, that's in today's standards. So the average is $380, which is equivalent to 12,000 today. So average 380, which today is 12,000, which the average person today, the medium income is around 64,000. So 12,000 today is, today's standards is pretty low, and is, in terms of today, is considered in poverty. So living conditions of the time, you have these downtown cities being built, these skyscrapers being built with Carnegie steel, railroads being built, and the upper class, the middle class living glamorous lifestyles in these new cities. The poor, however, are living in slums. There's crime, there's overcrowding, there's pollution and rampant disease, and millions of people. This is a reality. The reality of the gold, the reality of the American dream is not a reality. Instead, it's slums, it's crime, it's overcrowding, it's poverty, it's hunger, and that is what we're going to be looking at today. Tenements were the homes that often people in urban areas that were poor would live in. Here are some images. I just want you to think about what these images show, what they tell you about living conditions. So take a moment, pause the video, and look at the pictures and really try to think about, why are there pots sitting on the table? What does the floor look like? What does the living conditions really look like? So living in a tenement was very unsanitary. Oftentimes people would put their garbage in vents because there wasn't proper garbage collection. And so you can imagine on a really warm New York day what it would be like to live with the only clean air coming in was filled with this smell of garbage that had been sitting in the heat. So the smell was horrific. The hygiene was horrific. You had cholera, yellow fever, tuberculosis. Almost 25% of babies born in the late 19th century died before reaching one, just because of disease and the rough living conditions of the urban poor. Here's another image. This one on the right, I believe, is in Manhattan. So now one of the most expensive places to live in the country. This used to be what the properties there look like in the Gilded Age. This picture on the left shows how crowded and compact these living spaces were. You have laundry hanging in this middle area, which is similar to this image of the tenement homes, but very crowded one-room living spaces for whole families. Again, with the stink of the city, that you didn't have proper disposal. You had private cesspools, not proper water and plumbing, not proper garbage disposal, very unsanitary places to live. Working conditions were not much better. You had child labor because you had laissez-faire, hands-off government, and so children were able to work. It wasn't where, the youngest is 14, you can start working. No, then you had 4, 5, 6-year-olds working in factories, not very safe, not regulated factories. So look at this image and really think about, is this something you could even comprehend today in America? What kind of dangers and hazards come from a child in this situation? There is an assignment that you will do with child labor. You'll click on it, read the text and answer the questions. Look at the images and answer the questions. So make sure you do the child labor assignment, and this should help you understand what child labor, the dangers of child labor, and what it might be like for these children working in this industry. Women also did not, women and men, but women would often work in textiles, and their working conditions were not wonderful either. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory is one that really represents the dangers for workers at this time. 146 women died in New York due to a fire. They were locked into their workspace. The doors were locked so they could not go out and take breaks because their bosses wanted to squeeze as much out of them as they could for the cheapest amount of money. Time is money, and they really were worked to the bone and to their death in this case because of a fire. The youngest person working in this industry was 14, so a 14-year-old did die in this fire, and this generated national outrage, seeing the number of women that died, the lack of regulations, the lack of proactive precautions to make sure this didn't happen, really sparked outrage. But the working conditions had so much room to grow. Women had very little opportunities in the workspace, and the opportunities they did have were not great. Men as well had poor working conditions as well. But for this example, women really did not have protections in place to protect them, and this resulted in a large amount of women dying. Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, was trying to shed light on how immigrants were coming here for the American dream and then finding the filth and the rot under the promise of the American dream during the Gilded Age. It was about a meatpacking district, and he wrote about these immigrants chasing the American dream and what they found. Here's an image of a meatpacking plant, maybe the sanitation, and gives you an idea of what the conditions were like. Please go through and read these quotes. This first quote is about prostitution and how people were forced into these prostitution due to the lack of resources, due to the lack of opportunities given to them. Quote 2 talks about the working conditions, the unsanitary working conditions, and how the food was treated, mismanaged as well. Quote 3, again, please take the time and sit and read these. But quote 3 is about the main character. He ends up going to jail, and he talks about how it is comparing, is it better to be in jail where you have food and warmth than on the streets of an American city where you could freeze to death and starve and no one's going to do anything about it. So he's comparing jail and the city and which one's better, which one's worse. And hopefully the quote gives you what he believes his answer is. The last one is the conditions of their home, the district. So we looked at tenements, we looked at the conditions of living, and this is another quote that shows what living conditions would have been like in these poor areas. In Upton Sinclair's book, this is his take on the physical environment of the poor. The main themes of his book was about heartless factory owners, how they exploit their workers and put them in these horrible working and living conditions. He was a socialist. His idea was socialism versus capitalism. A lot of people were fed up with capitalism, with this laissez-faire, hands-off, no regulation, no accountability type of economics, type of society, and socialism, communism started to grow. Those ideologies started to grow during this time because people were fed up with the current situation. He shows how workers are seen as disposable. He often refers to them as animals for the slaughter, worked until every last ounce of their value is extracted, and then they move on to the next worker. And it really was supposed to be a commentary on how this lack of American dream, lack of opportunity, this mistreatment of the poor, to shed light on this and hopefully generate change. How it relates to today is there's still inequality. In 2019, there's about 52% of private household income was held by the top 20%, and not a lot of vertical mobility. If you start at the very bottom if you have the bottom 20%, you have about a 10% chance to reach the top 20%. So 10% chance to go from the bottom to the top in this country. So there is possibility, right? It is possible to achieve that extreme wealth or upper 20%, but it is slim and difficult. So it's still something that is discussed today, is still an issue today, and that is why we are talking about it. That is why we're learning about it. Sinclair was quoted saying, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." So he went for the public's heart. He went to talk about, this injustice of labor, and he ended up hitting people's stomachs because in 1906, when the book was written, the Pure Food and Drug Act was created. The book, how they talked about how food is handled, the conditions of food, and the workers handling the food really outraged people buying the food. If you read quote 2, you can imagine why people were outraged with the description of how their food is handled. And so it did create change. It created regulations on our food, but it did not do as much for workers in particular. It was more about food safety than worker safety. Okay. For the assignment you're going to have to do, you're going to have to compare Chicago by Carl Sandburg. That will be in the assignment. That's right here, the poem comparison. If you would like to hear an audio version of read aloud, that is included in the PowerPoint. But his poem is really about middle-class life in Chicago, and yes, acknowledging Chicago is a dangerous place to live, but he is still proud to be a part of this city that is vibrant and alive. And he talks about the city as a person, almost laughing this proud laughter. And yes, I acknowledge the dark sides like the jungle talks about, but I'm still proud and love my city. So read this poem, compare it to the jungle quotes, and then complete the assignment in the poem comparison section of Google Classroom. That is all for today. I hope you enjoyed listening. I hope this helped you study or review, and I will see you guys soon.